It was a chilling morning, November 14th, 1965, as the first rays of the sun cast long, haunting shadows across the Central Highlands. The stage was set for a battle that would go down in history as one of the deadliest confrontations of the entire Vietnam War. The air resonated with the thumping of helicopter blades, creating an intense sense of anticipation. Echoes of distant artillery fire reverberated through the hearts of young American soldiers as their faces etched with the grim understanding that they were venturing into the very jaws of danger. These brave men, members of the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, were about to embark on a mission that would test their mettle. As the UH-1D transport helicopters descended upon landing zone X-ray, a clearing amid the thick jungle, the tension was palpable. Below, the treacherous terrain awaited, concealing an invisible adversary, the North Vietnamese forces who lay in wait, ready to unleash a torrent of fury. This was the moment, the beginning of an epic struggle where bravery confronted fear and determination battled despair. The Battle of Drang was about to begin. By 1965, the escalating conflict in Vietnam saw the Viet Cong, or VC, aided by the regulars of the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, from the north, gain dominance in rural South Vietnam. To counter this, President Lyndon B. Johnson sanctioned General William C. Westmoreland of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, with over 300,000 U.S. regulars. As the VC entrenched itself in the Central Highlands, the region became a focal point. By 1964, North Vietnam turned the highlands into their stronghold and established the B3 Front, from which, by October 1965, started to conduct offensive operations. In response to the U.S. influx, the B3 Field Front Command organized an assault on the U.S. Army Special Forces Play Me camp. Initially set for December, they attacked on October 19th with 2 regiments, the 32nd and 33rd. Despite initial repulsions and reinforcements for the camp, a subsequent ambush hindered the ARVN reinforcements from Pleiku, who only reached Play Me on October 25th. The PAVN then retreated westwards to Chupong Massif. The stage was set for the U.S. troops to get to grips with the enemy. With PAVN forces entrenched deep in the jungle, the U.S. strategists deemed it perfect to implement the new air mobility tactics against the enemy, leveraging helicopters for swift troop movement and support. Pioneers of the tactic were the men of the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, who were deployed to Camp Radcliffe and Key post-Play Me siege. General Westmoreland spurred the 1st Cavalry Division to go on the offensive in Pleiku Province. Successive skirmishes in early November highlighted the presence of yet another PAVN unit, the 66th Regiment, leading to the 1st Brigade being relieved by the 3rd Brigade. On receiving intelligence about PAVN regiment locations, the 3rd Brigade, under orders from higher command, prepared for an air assault near the Chupong Massif. Consequently, on November 13th, the 3rd Brigade's Colonel Brown instructed Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, to undertake an airmobile assault on the enemy. With explicit instructions to avoid scaling the mountain, Moore meticulously selected multiple landing zones, or LZs, in its vicinity. They were named after the NATO phonetic alphabet. LZ X-ray was the primary choice, situated at the Chupong Massif's eastern base. Other zones included LZ Albany, LZ Columbus, LZ Tango, LZ Yankee, LZ Whiskey, and LZ Victor. Among them, LZ Yankee posed challenges due to its sloping terrain, accommodating fewer helicopters. Artillery support was slated to come from the FSB Falcon, situated northeast of X-ray. Planning the action was a formidable challenge for Lieutenant Colonel Moore. In his memoirs, he acknowledged receiving intelligence reports indicating the presence of the PAVN 66th Regiment in the perilous Chupong Massif and adjacent Ia Drang Valley. The mission was to transport his battalion into this hazardous area via air assault on November 14th. However, Moore's battalion was significantly under strength, with only 431 troops out of the authorized 633 due to various factors, including illnesses and enlistment terminations. Moreover, there were just 24 Huey Slicks available for the 3rd Brigade. a scarcity attributed to maintenance issues resulting from extensive prior use. The UH-1D transport helicopters designed for 11 troops could accommodate only about 5 due to the thin air in the Central Highlands. This necessitated 6 lifts to transport the entire battalion, exposing the first 80 troops to potential danger for 30 minutes before the second lift would arrive. Moore added to the risk by planning to send a platoon of the 1st Company for enemy probing, while the rest formed an assault formation, thus departing from the typical defensive perimeter approach. On the day of the operation, Moore selected LZ X-ray. Positioned on the edge of the Chu Pong Massif, this location offered early enemy contact potential. Moore issued the operations order at 0845, anticipating the presence of one North Vietnamese battalion near the LZ. Artillery fire was planned for nearby clearings to deceive the enemy, followed by 20 minutes of fire around X-ray. Helicopter gunships were to provide support as the battalion command group and part of Bravo Company landed. Subsequent lifts were planned to bring in the remaining companies, with Charlie Company serving as the battalion reserve. This meticulously planned operation embarked on a path fraught with danger and uncertainty, setting the stage for one of the fiercest battles of the Vietnam War. Preparatory fires began at 10:17 and were remarkably accurate, leading to an unopposed landing at 10:48. The terrain at Landing Zone X-ray was challenging. It resembled a funnel, approximately 100 meters in length, with its broadest end situated near a dried creek bed. Colonel Moore selected a grove of trees near a prominent 10-foot termite mound as his command post. This location was at the center of the open clearing. The dense vegetation near the western part of X-ray gave way to jungle-clad foothills leading to the Chu Pong Massif. This foliage was double-edged. While providing cover, it restricted visibility and allowed potential enemies to approach without detection. Unbeknownst to Colonel Moore, multiple battalions from the North Vietnamese 66th Regiment and a battalion of the 33D Regiment were stationed near Chu Pong, overlooking X-ray. Despite having encountered conflict at Plei Me, these battalions, numbering around 1,600 soldiers, were strategically placed to strike. Additionally, there were other regiments and battalions in proximity. At 10:48, Colonel Moore, along with a contingent from Bravo Company, made their landing at X-ray. On landing, reconnaissance was dispatched beyond the landing zone while most troops stayed near the center. Recon troops captured a North Vietnamese soldier who confirmed the presence of large enemy forces nearby, aligning with the prior intelligence. Colonel Moore then adjusted tactics, widening the search area. As time passed, subsequent lifts brought more troops into X-ray. By early afternoon, the rest of the troops from the Bravo Alpha Companies, well as Companies Alpha and Charlie, had landed, marking the end of the unopposed troop placements at the landing zone. At approximately 12:30, Captain Heron's Bravo Company initiated their search around the landing zone X-ray, using the adjacent creek bed as a starting point. The formation consisted of 2 platoons moving forward with 1 behind. However, by 12:45, the 1st platoon faced sniper fire from both sides, immobilizing them, while the 2nd platoon also encountered resistance. Despite the volatile situation, 2nd Lieutenant Henry T. Herrick pursued enemy soldiers, resulting in his detachment from the rest of the company. By 13:30, the Bravo Company was ensnared in full-scale combat against the enemy. Colonel Moore recognized the gravity of the situation. Predicting a potential assault on his command post, he directed Captain Nadal's Alpha Company to the front line. This move deviated from the initial plan. Moore's strategy aimed at ensuring Bravo Company's safety and assisting Lieutenant Herrick, who went too deep in the forest chasing the enemy and got surrounded. He also positioned parts of Captain Edwards' Charlie Company to counter any flanking moves by the enemy. The subsequent hours were pivotal. While the North Vietnamese engaged Herrick's 2nd platoon, other segments of Bravo Company and elements from Alpha Company moved to counteract. Unfortunately, due to fierce resistance, the surrounded platoon remained isolated, leading to Colonel Moore's decision to pull back the rest of Bravo Company by 14:30. Colonel Moore had anticipated enemy offensives from the western or southwestern regions. In alignment with this foresight, he had ordered defensive postures around the landing zone. Captain Edwards and parts of his Charlie Company, who were newly arrived, faced intense enemy fire as they established their positions. This strategy, though strategically sound, left Moore's battalion without backup and exposed other areas of X-ray. At 1442, the 5th lift, comprising 16 helicopters, reached X-ray. 8 successfully landed, deploying a large portion of Charlie Company. Due to intensified enemy fire from the mountain slopes, the remaining 8 helicopters were redirected. Captain Edwards integrated the newcomers into his unit, and almost immediately they faced an enemy assault from the southwest. The American forces countered with gunfire, artillery, and air support, causing significant North Vietnamese casualties. A critical moment arose when a helicopter carrying 4 front elements of Captain Lefebvre's Delta Company landed amidst a North Vietnamese push. Shielded by machine gun fire from Nadal's Alpha Company, Lefebvre and a few others disembarked and positioned themselves directly opposing the enemy. Despite their minimal numbers, they successfully repelled the attack, a potential turning point for the battle. Around 1520, the rest of Delta Company and the battalion reconnaissance platoon landed. At Captain Edwards' request, Moore deployed Delta Company to cover Charlie Company's open flank, while the reconnaissance platoon fortified the northern and eastern borders. This allowed Moore to finally establish a complete defensive ring. The primary objective was still the rescue of Herrick's platoon. They too had formed a defensive circle, but their commander took a hit, leaving Staff Sergeant Clyde Savage in command. Moore planned to engage 2 companies for their rescue. The rescue attempt was to commence by 1620. The orchestrated assault, backed by artillery, started as planned. However, Companies Alpha and Bravo faced concealed, entrenched North Vietnamese forces who managed to infiltrate the artillery barrage. In an ensuing close combat, Bravo Company encountered 30 casualties within a short advancement, and Alpha Company, though slightly ahead, also faced heavy losses. In the heat of battle, Lieutenant Walter Joseph Marm, Jr., Alpha Company's 2nd platoon leader, showcased unparalleled bravery under dire circumstances. As his company sought a path to relieve their surrounded comrades, Marm led his men straight into a hail of enemy bullets. With his platoon pinned down and spotting 4 enemies advancing toward them, he took swift action under the weight of enemy fire to eliminate all 4 enemy soldiers. However, the most significant threat was yet to be confronted, a concealed machine gun that poured relentless fire upon his men. With audacious courage, Marm intentionally exposed himself to the enemy burst to locate the machine gun's position. Once aware of the enemy's position, he took an anti-tank weapon to neutralize it. While he managed to inflict casualties, the enemy machine gun continued its deadly fire. Without a moment's hesitation, Marm embarked on a daring 30-meter dash across an open field, throwing grenades at the enemy position. In doing so, he managed to eliminate several of the 8 enemy soldiers manning the position. Even after sustaining severe injuries and having exhausted his grenades, Lieutenant Marm, armed solely with his rifle, persisted in his assault, ultimately killing the remaining adversaries. His self-sacrificing actions not only diminished the enemy fire raining down on his platoon, but also disrupted the enemy's momentum. It gave a large morale boost to his unit to press forward toward their surrounded friends. 2nd Lieutenant Moore survived his wounds and was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery in combat. However, despite the courage shown by the American soldiers in an attempt to save their comrades, their enemy's resistance was relentless. Given the mounting casualties, Colonel Moore ultimately decided to postpone the rescue, considering a possible renewed attempt either overnight or the following day, but ensured robust artillery support remained. The gravity of the situation and the formidable enemy presence led Moore to request an additional rifle company to bolster defenses and endure a night in hostile territory. He also called for intensive artillery and airstrikes to secure X-ray surroundings. Colonel Brown, recognizing the significant threat that lured over the 1st Battalion, arranged further reinforcements, deploying Captain Deduric's Bravo Company from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. Anticipating larger engagements ahead, Brown positioned additional battalions near X-ray. He also appealed to General Kinnard for another battalion, and consequently, Colonel Ackerson's 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, was slated to arrive at Stadium the next morning. By 1700, the ferocity of the enemy's onslaught at X-ray diminished. This lull enabled the landing of 120 soldiers from Captain de Duric's Bravo Company, which Colonel Moore designated as X-ray's backup. Over the next hours, he refined the defense, transitioning from a makeshift line to a more structured 360-degree perimeter. As night approached, helicopters shuttled essential supplies and evacuated casualties. The soldiers, having relied on sea ration jams and even salty meal water for hydration due to the dry stream bed, eagerly consumed the water brought in. By 1915, bolstered to 5 companies' strength, Moore's battalion braced itself for the night, their morale lifted by the day's survival against daunting odds. Throughout the night, the North Vietnamese tested X-ray's defenses with small probes, attempting to identify American machine gun nests. Under Moore's orders, American troops displayed restraint, countering only with rifles and grenade launchers. To preempt potential nocturnal offensives, artillery from Falcon targeted probable enemy positions, releasing over 4,000 explosive rounds. Concurrently, the Air Force engaged, with A-1E Sky Raiders targeting areas experiencing heightened enemy activity. An overhead C-123 flare ship provided illumination when required. In the forest, Sergeant Savage's cutoff platoon resisted 3 attempts to overwhelm them. An AC-47 Spooky gunship provided crucial support, raining down thousands of rounds and staving off further threats. In the end, the day's turmoil gave way to a cautious nighttime vigilance. Determined to save the isolated platoon, Colonel Moore crafted a strategy overnight. He envisioned a daybreak assault led by Heron's Bravo Company, flanked by Nadal's and Edwards Companies Alpha and Charlie, with Moore and his command group closely following. The defense at the landing zone would rest on Lytton's Delta Company and de Duric's Bravo Company, standing as a reserve. On November 15th, Moore directed a reconnaissance mission around 0640. However, by 0650, 2 of Charlie Company's patrols faced enemy fire, suffering casualties. In their hasty withdrawal, they were pursued by North Vietnamese troops that were most likely positioned for an imminent attack. The enemy, estimated to be 2 to 3 companies strong, mounted a fierce assault on X-ray's southern border, with Alpha and Charlie Company facing the brunt. Despite the intensity, Moore refrained from deploying the battalion reserve, skeptical of this being the primary attack. The situation escalated with enemy forces reaching close combat range. Spec Willard Parrish of the Charlie Company was fiercely defending his perimeter behind the trigger of an M60 machine gun. After he had spent all of his ammunition repelling enemy wave attacks, he continued to fight them off using his .45 caliber pistol. After the dust settled, there were around 100 bodies of NVA soldiers around his machine gun position. Realizing the gravity of the potential breach, Edwards pressed for reinforcements. While Moore remained hesitant about deploying the battalion reserve, he allowed Nadal to dispatch a platoon. This group, after facing heavy fire, reached Charlie Company around an hour later, providing a much-needed reinforcement, albeit with losses. Their arrival fortified the defenses, deterring any attempts to breach the battalion's command center. As the day progressed, the intensity of the battle expanded. At 0715, an enemy contingent targeted Delta Company in the northeast. Recognizing the escalating threat, Moore deployed his reserve, the battalion reconnaissance platoon, to bridge the gap between companies D and C. The ferocity of the enemy's barrage was so acute that any internal movement became perilous. Within a short span, the North Vietnamese commander had unleashed roughly 1,000 troops in a comprehensive effort to overwhelm X-ray. Despite the mounting pressure, Moore's forces resiliently held their positions. Around 0800, Moore sought more reinforcements from HQ. Although he was assured of backup, their immediate availability was constrained due to the intensity of enemy fire, which was why Tully's battalion prepared for a march from Landing Zone Victor to X-ray. To provide a clear demarcation for external fire support, Moore instructed his units to pop smoke grenades along the perimeter. The resultant fire, both internal and from supporting gunships and artillery, mitigated the force of the enemy assault. A trio of F-100S further suppressed the enemy movement, releasing a barrage of napalm, iron bombs, and cannon fire in close proximity to X-ray. By 0900, reinforcements from Alpha Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, under Captain Joel E. Sugdenis, began their descent. Moore directed them to support Edwards' heavily battered southern sector. By 0941, the relentless enemy onslaught on Companies Charlie and Delta waned, with the majority of the North Vietnamese forces initiating a withdrawal, leaving only sporadic sniper threats. In engagements at X-Ray, Charlie Company endured significant losses, with 42 of its 153 soldiers killed and 62 wounded, forcing Moore to reconfigure the positioning of troops at his disposal. Concurrently, Colonel Tully's 2nd Battalion of the 5th Cavalry was approaching X-Ray systematically, anticipating potential attacks from the Chupong Massif area. However, contrary to their expectations, the battalion encountered no resistance, and the foremost units arrived at X-Ray around noon. With Moore's seniority, he assumed leadership over all American forces at the landing zone, inclusive of Tully's. With reinforcements secured, Moore prioritized the retrieval of Sergeant Savage's stranded platoon. Forming a battalion-sized task force, the rescue mission began at 13:15. Their progression was flanked by artillery and aerial fire support, reaching their objective around 15:20 without encountering resistance. The rescue was swift, with the group returning to X-Ray by 16:20. Out of 29 soldiers that set out on the previous day, 9 were killed and 13 wounded. The survival of these men was attributed to Sergeant Savage's leadership and the precision of American artillery, which protected them throughout their isolation. In the afternoon, the U.S. offensive received air support that was supposed to surpass everything that was thrown at the North Vietnamese by that point. At 1600, 18 Air Force B-52 Stratofortress bombers targeted the Chupong Massif. This was their inaugural use in an active tactical operation, and the extent of their destruction was yet to be assessed. Yet General Westmoreland attested to the raid's efficacy, leading to subsequent bombings over the following days. By the 22nd, the Arc-Light raids, comprising 96 sorties, had released nearly 5,000 bombs, inflicting notable distress among the enemy. The twilight hours of November 15th remained uneventful, providing Moore an opportunity to fortify his defenses. Throughout the night and into dawn, continuous artillery barrages targeted X-Ray's neighboring terrains, triggering multiple secondary explosions. As a new day neared, the American forces, bolstered by proximity artillery batteries and available air support, stood in a far more advantageous position compared to the previous day. In the pre-dawn hours of November 16th, the North Vietnamese mounted multiple attacks. Around 0400, a movement was detected south of Bravo Company's positions. Soon after, high-pitched whistles used by the enemy for coordination echoed in the distance. At 0420, Bravo Company's left flank confronted approximately 300 assailants advancing from the southeast, repelling them successfully. Shortly thereafter, either the same or a different enemy force struck across the same sector. Relying on supporting 105mm artillery, the American forces thwarted the offensive, causing notable enemy casualties. 2 additional assaults targeted Duduric Company's position, one at 0530 and another around 0630, both yielding limited results. Then all hell let loose. At 0655, Moore initiated a mad-minute directive, instructing his troops to fire indiscriminately into the surrounding woods. This barrage, lasting 2 minutes, neutralized 6 concealed snipers and sparked the enemy's final charge towards X-Ray. North Vietnamese forces, previously concealed in the grass and undergrowth, rose, either believing they had been discovered or that an attack was underway. American artillery and gunfire halted their advance, forcing them into a panic retreat. In the aftermath of the intense battle at X-Ray, a lull settled over the area. Moore, assessing the situation, ordered patrols stretching 300 to 500 meters from the perimeter. By 0955, Bravo Company engaged a small group of armed, wounded North Vietnamese, taking 1 casualty and neutralizing 27 enemies during the sweep. Colonel Moore's gaze swept across the battlefield. The desolate sight of enemy casualties sprawled across a torn and gouged land was chilling. The remnants of the North Vietnamese forces retreated northward, along the base of the Chupong Massif. The battle at X-Ray was unprecedented in scale, significantly weakening the North Vietnamese forces. As noon approached on the 16th of November, reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry and Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry reached X-Ray. At 11:55, Moore initiated the withdrawal of his exhausted troops. By 1500, most had been airlifted to landing zone Falcon, eventually making their way to Camp Holloway. After 2 intense days, the horrors at LZ X-Ray seemed to have ended, but the scars left behind told a different story, a tale of one of the Vietnam War's fiercest fightings. Yet as the dust settled and soldiers caught their breath, little did they know that the true nightmare was yet to unfold. Mere miles away at landing zone Albany, the worst of Drang awaited. The battle was far from over. Thank you for watching part 1 of Drang. Hit the bell icon to be notified when part 2 is released, and don't forget to subscribe to the Militology channel for more content. Stay tuned.